So a few months back I mentioned that 007 First Light was one of my most anticipated games of the year, and having now played it, I can say with confidence that it is definitely my favorite Bond game that I've played since GoldenEye, which is probably not surprising for a lot of people. So today I just wanted to do a video specifically on 007 First Light and why it's been so intriguing to me, and why it really does feel like GoldenEye for a new generation. Now, when it comes to my personal history with James Bond, I would not call myself an aficionado by any stretch of the imagination. As an aging millennial, like a lot of people who grew up playing the original GoldenEye, Pierce Brosnan was the Bond that I personally grew up with. And then later on in the early 2000s, when we started to get Daniel Craig, I liked watching his movies as well, but ultimately I never really considered myself a James Bond superfan because, well, there's just a ton of the movies that I haven't seen, and I certainly haven't read the original books. And if I'm being honest, when we talk about any Bond video games after GoldenEye, a lot of those kind of left a sour taste in my mouth. There was at least one attempt to kind of capitalize on the GoldenEye name by just calling a game GoldenEye, but I never played that one because I guess it got panned pretty badly critically, and ultimately there just weren't a lot of subsequent entries that really got me excited. That is, until I first saw 007 First Light, because even from the title it was clear to me that this was going to be a reimagining of Bond that I could follow right from the beginning. So even though I personally had a very spotty history with the character in movies and obviously books and to, well, I guess a greater extent the video games, this was going to be a nice jumping on point for anybody who either just had gotten away from the character or somebody who might be checking out Bond for the first time to really see what he's all about. And despite the fact that a lot of licensed games based on movies historically have not been very good, there have been some bright spots here and there, and while I think it's not nearly as bad as it was in like the early to mid 2000s where we just got a ton of games that were not very good that were based on movies, I remain cautiously optimistic about this one just because the production value seemed to be so high. And while I wouldn't call myself the biggest Hitman fan either necessarily, I was fairly confident that the developers would not have any issue translating those mechanics into the Bond experience, and it did seem like a natural fit. Now going back to that GoldenEye comparison for a second, obviously mechanically these are very different games. I'm not saying that you didn't do some spy-oriented stuff whenever you play GoldenEye. There were certainly sub-objectives within each map that you could take on to see if you could get a better score or unlock different cheats within that game, but I think it's fair to say that GoldenEye's greater legacy was normalizing the first-person shooter on consoles, and certainly normalizing multiplayer first-person shooters on home console. And because of that, I do think a lot of people tend to forget that even though, yes, that was one of the strongest points of the GoldenEye experience from back in the day, it also had a lot of cool moments that were peppered throughout the campaign as well. Whether you were hacking into a computer, or sneaking your way into a lockdown facility, bungee jumping off of a dam, joyriding around in a tank, or making a daring escape in a plane. And by today's standards, you could definitely call the GoldenEye experience a little bit primitive, or at least a little bit dated. You gotta give props to Rare not only for providing a stellar first-person shooter experience whose legacy will be recognized for decades, but also for doing a stellar job in translating the Pierce Brosnan James Bond to a video game experience. And I think that's really the first thing that really jumped out at me about 007 First Light as I worked through those opening hours. I mean, yeah, it was novel to just see Bond from the jump and kind of see his backstory before he's a member of MI6, but it was also really cool seeing how some of the things that were a little bit clunkier back in the original GoldenEye could be realized and way more fleshed out in something like 007 First Light. Because yes, I've definitely shot up my fair share of bad guys so far in 007 First Light, but the thing that's really grabbing me and making me stay with this game to the point where I'm definitely going to roll credits on this one is just how fun it is to step into the role of James Bond as a fully fleshed out character who has a range of abilities beyond just shooting guys. And a lot of those memories you might have of Bond's best moments in cinema get translated pretty well here. Whether that's just checking out gadgets in the Q lab, driving around in fast cars, charming your way out of sticky situations, or just making a big audacious escape in a completely unconventional way, just about everything you ever saw Bond do on screen where you're like, oh, that's kinda cool, you get some taste of that here, and I'm thrilled to just see what each new level has to offer. And it's for those reasons that I think 007 First Light is just an exceptionally cool video game to play, whether you're a longtime veteran of the series and the character, or if you're a complete newcomer. And it became clear to me very quickly that obviously the developers know how to do a great stealth action game, but also that they very much understood the character of Bond, and a lot of those little attributes that make him special. Because again, it's not just things like fast car chases, or beautiful women, or, gadgets or anything like that, but it's also these quieter moments that really sell the experience. And in fact, some of my favorite moments about the 007 First Light experience have nothing to do with using spy gadgets or shooting somebody or making some daring escape, and it has a lot more to do with the quieter, more detail-oriented moments. For example, anytime you find yourself in a new area, whether that's a nightclub or a fancy gala, you can just beeline the objectives and sub-objectives to try to find the best way to reach your goal, but you can also just kind of chill in the environment and really take in all of the additional details they've added to really sell the experience. And if you want, there is nothing stopping you from just aimlessly wandering around MI6 HQ just to see whatever weird notes and things you might stumble across. Sometimes they're little inside jokes or nods to the movies, and then other times they give greater context to the missions that you've already participated in, and really paint a more detailed picture of James Bond's impact on the world around him. And it doesn't hurt that the dialogue delivery and really the writing as a whole is absolutely top tier. And some of my favorite parts so far have been whenever James is just sort of sneaking his way through enemy territory and having a playful banter back and forth with Moneypenny. Because if the developers had really gone all in just on the action of James Bond while ignoring those quieter moments that really flesh out his character, I think it would have been a much more boring game to play. But thankfully they don't fall into this trap at all, and the pacing in the game is excellent. Yes, there are high-octane moments of action, but they are almost always bordered by those quieter moments of exploration and just really getting to enjoy the experience of being James Bond. And I think that pacing is the thing that really surprised me the most about the game. I won't spoil exactly what happens in the opening hours that sort of leads James Bond to begin his journey at MI6, but what I will say is one of the most boring parts of any game that I expect is just going to be an absolute slog is that opening tutorial level where they kind of show you the ropes and get you used to the game's mechanics. And I say this with no reservation whatsoever, this game has my favorite tutorial level of all time. It is completely brisk, it utterly respects the player's time, and at the same time it is perfectly appropriate for James Bond because not only does it get you acclimated to those controls extremely quickly and lets you get on with the game, but it also kind of speaks thematically to James's natural aptitude as an MI6 agent. And that's why I'm only going to show a sliver of it here, because I really wouldn't want to ruin the experience for you, but trust me, once you get to the place where you're like, oh, this is going to be really boring for about another 20 or 30 minutes, and then the game will open up and let me play it, not the case at all. You will have a wonderful time with this, I promise you. Now, First Light isn't a perfect game or anything, right? There are some moments where I feel like it's just a little bit too easy for its own good, but if you're the kind of player who really does just want to take in a really great story and experience, and you're not somebody who necessarily wants to torture themselves with a really high difficulty ceiling, I think First Light is probably tunable enough to give you a good experience. I mean, I guess if you really wanted to challenge yourself, you could try to go into certain scenarios and only make sure that you act as a spy and slink your way around rather than go in guns blazing, but however you choose to approach the objectives in 007 First Light, whether that's taking an unorthodox route through the map, stealing a keycard from some unsuspecting bellhop, or just disguising yourself as a member of the hotel staff, it is consistently thrilling to find those little solutions, even if it might not be quite as over-the-top thrilling as some of the larger gunfights you'll find yourself in. But yeah, I think my biggest takeaway from the experience overall was that, surprisingly, it really made me care about James Bond again. So if you're like me where you only have a passing familiarity with James Bond or maybe a small subset of Bond's history, this game is definitely worth checking out. Again, I would say whether you're a veteran or a complete newcomer. If you're a veteran, I think you can sort of enjoy it as a what-if or a spin-off of sorts where you get to see an entirely new universe of Bond that's really not restrained by any of the past movies or anything like that. And if you're a total newcomer who never really saw what the big deal was about Bond, well, this doesn't drop you right into the middle of his career, it takes you right from the beginning of his career so you can really develop a deeper appreciation for the character and live out that experience for yourself. So yeah, to wrap this whole thing up, no, I would not have called myself a James Bond superfan by any stretch of the imagination, but I had periodically enjoyed James Bond both in movies and games here and there, and for the first time in many, many years, 007 First Light has made me care about James Bond again. But hey, what about you? I would be curious to hear your thoughts on 007 First Light. Is it a game that you also were looking forward to this year, or were cautiously optimistic about? Are you like a James Bond superfan who was never going to miss this game, or are you still kind of on the fence about it? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. As for what's coming up on the channel, we will be doing some retro stuff in the coming weeks. Also, I've got some Xbox content lined up, and then finally some Steam Deck pickups that I've been thoroughly enjoying lately, so stay tuned for that. As always, thank you so much for your time and hanging out here on the channel. It really means a lot to me. Take care, and I will see you on the next one. Bye.